Well, we've got, AJ's not here yet.
Oh, is he gonna show? Is he
I
gonna
see AJ.
pass it down?
Is AJ coming? AJ?
Not if he took my email to heart, no. I mean, he was probably confused, but that would explain why he's not here.
Oh. Okay.
Oh, thank God. Is he just late, or did I completely screw him up?
I think you probably just talked to his girlfriend. Lord Frost, and she told him.
Let's see, do you know?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, AJ.
Yeah.
Extra.
Wait,
Okay.
I got it. I just need to, yeah.
Denise, is this from the training you and I went to? Okay.
You got his tie off.
No tie. I took the tie off for you. I did.
Everybody fit? Okay, well, welcome everybody to the May 13th, 2019 meeting of the Village of Yellow Springs Planning Commission. Calling the meeting to order, will you call the roll, please?
Indeed. Doden,
Here.
Stiles,
Here.
McQueen,
Here.
Williams,
Here.
Donnell.
Here.
Also present is Planning and Zoning Administrator Denise Swinger, Solicitor Chris Connard, and alternate Dino Pallotta in the audience for now.
Right, I'll just review the agenda. We'll go over the minutes. Doesn't look like we have any communications. Is that still the case?
Correct.
Okay. Council report?
Oh, I'd like to go back to review the agenda. I have,
Oh, okay.
I have something that I would like to tell Planning Commission about, and then we need to decide where that would come. So what it is this is, was brought to my attention by Judith Hempfling, and I know she's talked to you, Denise, that in our zoning, while a single-family home can have an accessory dwelling unit, a duplex cannot.
Right.
And so I would like, and I'm not, I don't see any reason why a duplex can't if a single family can. And so I would like that to be either have Planning Commission review it, or I'll bring it to council and then knock it back to Planning Commission. So I'm not sure which.
I'm not really in agreement with changing it, and the reason why is because typically duplexes are rentals, and an accessory dwelling unit can't have a separate meter. And then you get into the issue of parking. I just don't know that it's a good idea to go down that road.
Okay, then I'll
but
bring it.
Take
to
the council.
council.
Yep.
Okay.
We have
I
a
guess
council.
I would ask a question on that. I mean, would you want a staff report on that before taking it to council? Mariana, is that necessary, or you'll just summarize the position of Denise, or will you be
Pardon?
there?
I don't know. Do you want me to give my reasons why I don't think it's a good idea?
Should
To
You mean like
council?
discuss
I
it
mean,
here at this meeting
a little?
Well, in the context of council having information from the zoning administrator in some formal process, so that council would know that staff has an opinion on the subject.
Well, I think there are reasons to have that be allowed, or at least as a conditional use. So if you, Denise, want to write up something about why you think it shouldn't, and I'll write up something about why I think it should, and I guess give it to council and bring it back to Planning Commission? Or
Well, I
what?
mean, it just is gonna go back to the whole thing of separate metering. I don't know how you're gonna do that.
Should we discuss it maybe at this meeting, just
Yeah,
briefly, so we can sort of get the
Well,
opinion?
that was my question. I wasn't
down
sure where to
under-
have the
Yeah.
discussion to begin
Put it
with.
down under new
Yeah.
business.
Under new business?
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of that. This is not publicly noticed. No one knows you're having
No.
the conversation. It's not a rush. There's no urgency.
Okay. That
So
makes sense.
Judy, what are you suggesting?
That you suggest it go on the agenda for the next meeting.
For the next meeting, okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Put it under agenda planning.
okay.
Okay, yeah, so you will have a council report, Mary Ann?
Yes.
Okay. And then we'll have any citizen comments about non-agenda items, have a bunch of public hearings on a series of text amendments, most of them having to do with transient housing, but a couple having to do with quorums in the voting process. Old business, new business, sunshine information refresher, agenda planning, which we talked about, and then we'll adjourn. So, any other additions or questions about the agenda? Okay, let's go on to the review of the minutes from the April 8th, 2019 meeting. Any questions or corrections to anything on page 1 of the minutes? Page 2. Page 3.
I have one
On page 3?
on page 3. So it's three-fourths of the way down the paragraph that starts with style stated.
There's a big paragraph there.
Yeah. And at the end, it says, some people lost their affordable housing because they have not been responsible tenants, she stated. And the transient guests take better care of the property in the cases she was aware of. And I would want to add, as stated by transient housing owners, because I was simply bringing information that I heard at that meeting. And so it wasn't, I was repeating what they said. So if we could just add that, as stated by transient housing owners.
Is that okay with everybody? Okay. Anything else on page 3? Page 4? Is there a motion to approve the minutes
I move approval of the minutes of May 13th.
for April 8th?
I'm sorry, April 8th, I'm sorry, April 8th.
Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed?
I'm abstaining.
All right. So the minutes have been approved. Okay, no communications.
With one abstention.
Guess we'll go on to the council report then, Mary Ann?
Yeah. So a couple things that aren't housing related, but I just want to let planning commission know in case you don't have been under a rock or something. So we will be having a new village manager, Josue Samaroon. He will be starting, I think, June 17th, which is, that would be his first council meeting, I think. So, and hopefully he'll come to a planning commission meeting so everyone can meet him. Then another upcoming event is it's a community police forum on Tuesday, May 21st from 7 to 9. And I hope you all consider coming to that. It'll be using a process called an appreciative inquiry, where people meet in triads and talk about what is working and how the police department and the community police relationships could be even better, and challenges that we're facing. So there'll be time to talk in very small groups and
Where
as
will
a
that be?
whole. That will be meeting in the gym at the Bryan Center at
And-
7 o'clock.
And what was the date again?
Tuesday, May 21st,
Of
2 weeks
21st.
from tomorrow.
A week from tomorrow.
A week from tomorrow. Thank you. Yes.
And you said 7?
7 to 9, yeah, yeah. Okay, so the council report is about some one is upcoming, one is in process. So I met with Brian Hausch today to talk with him about a couple things. First, I had not participated in the discussion about transient guest lodging because of, I have one. But I did read the minutes about it, and I'm not clear whether planning commission was planning on having another session on it or not. In talking with, I'll first say I was disappointed that other things about transient guest lodging were not considered. In particular, I was disappointed that it was not considered to disallow transient guest lodging in standalone housing units. Because I'm very concerned about that Yellow Springs is becoming more and more of a tourist town, and that those units are be bought up by investors and will mean that people can't own them, small homes, or rent them. But at any rate, in talking with Brian Hausch, his understanding of what the direction for Planning Commission was that Planning Commission was supposed to look at each of the, there were about 6 options, I guess. Now, I couldn't tell from the minutes whether Planning Commission did review all of those things and decided not to do anything other than a conditional use. But, so that's sort of a question, because I understood from Brian, and I wasn't part of some of that communication at council either, but Brian's desire, and I guess the rest of council, was that Planning Commission look at all of the options that had been listed. I think it was Patty Bates, or maybe it was Denise, or together, had listed the various things.
There were 4. It's
There
in
were
my
4.
report. There were
Yeah.
4. Yeah.
Perhaps we could discuss them again? I guess, my memory is, I don't think we did discuss them real thoroughly. We discussed a couple of them, but like there were a couple I know that we didn't.
So, I mean, either you can decide you're going to discuss them, or it'll come, or council will then say, hey, we want you to discuss whatever it is. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I'm going to be recommending to council that Yellow Springs develop an incentive-based inclusionary housing policy. And that would come back to Planning Commission. And I just would like to take a few minutes to talk about what that would probably look like. So inclusionary zoning is usually when there's an ordinance that stipulates that in a housing development of a certain number of units, a certain percentage of those units have to be affordable. And there are all sorts of stipulations. That would be mandatory. Probably what we would be doing, it would be not mandatory, and it really wouldn't be zoning, but I think the proper term would probably be incentive-based inclusionary housing, which would mean that Planning Commission and a planning department would have incentives that would be offered to get a housing developer to include a percentage of affordable housing units in that development. And the incentives would be whatever is decided that they would be. Increased density, could be tap fee waivers, could be reduced parking. There are a number of things that could be included. So I'm going to be making that proposal to council, that council ask Planning Commission to develop that, and that we would have come to Planning Commission with some of the outlines of what we would, council, assuming council agrees with this. So, does anyone have any questions at this point about that? No? Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next thing on the agenda is citizen comments, and I suspect that we're not going to have any citizen comments tonight. Don't have any citizens here tonight.
Oh, you're not a citizen.
Well, all right, I guess we'll move on to the public hearings then. We have a series of text amendments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is it 7 of them having to do with?
5.
2, 3, 4,
Oh.
5.
5 that
Oh,
have
I
to
see.
do with,
There-
yeah,
just, yeah, 1,
5
2,
that have
3,
to do
4,
with
5.
transit gas lodging.
With transit housing, and the last 2 having to do with
Last few have to
clarifying
do with
forms
voting.
and voting process.
Yeah.
All right, so we just take them one at a time then?
So we have to recuse, Ted and I have to recuse ourselves.
Right.
Should we leave the room or what?
Yeah, the reason to leave the room is so that you're not influencing the body.
Yeah, oh, that's fine. I don't have any problem leaving the room.
Was Lisa Krieger coming? Lisa Krieger didn't make it.
He already
No,
left.
because she's,
No.
yeah, so,
So they're leaving because of this?
You think?
yeah, just the whole thing.
Okay, so let me go ahead and get started on this.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you.
so, it was my understanding that the way we left it at the last meeting, after we reviewed 4 things. Returning transit guest lodging back to a conditional use, only allowing transit guest lodging where the owner lives on site, limiting the number of transit guest lodging establishments, and limiting transit guest lodging to permanent residents, of which our solicitor suggested that we not do number 4. So as a result of that, I was asked to bring back 2 things. One was the, what we had established before, when we had proposed it as a conditional use a couple years back to council when they then, well, it was already conditional use. We wanted to add some more requirements of that conditional use, and that was when council decided to make it a permitted use and removed all of that. And the other thing I was asked to do was to come up with a map showing where transit guest lodgings are currently located in case we wanted to do anything, capping by districts or something like that. And so that's where we're at. So I have included in this the specific sections that would be influenced by changing it back to a conditional use. And then if you want to add anything else, if you decide that you want to do any caps of restricting it, or if you want to only allow it where the owner lives on site, although that one was one that the people.
Was a problem for people out of
For
town.
people that were, and there were some people that actually own transit guest lodging that don't live in the transit guest lodging, but live in the community.
So
So,
it's a different one.
so I kind of guess maybe we should just open it up for that discussion first and see where we fall, and then we can go back and modify these amendments if necessary.
So we want to limit outside investors. Is that a true statement, or is that up for debate? I think that's what Chris was saying. We don't want to go down that road, or can we go down that road, or is it a proper road to even attempt to go down?
I would frame the issue a little differently. I think that the issue for any community that has a destination component to it is to preserve the housing stock for people who intend to live there permanently and not undermine the character or the feel of the community. And one of the ways to do that would be, I think, the most benign in some ways, would be to limit the number of establishments that can get the permits. It's simple, it's a baseline. The council would have the ability to adjust that number based upon the evidence that comes forward. And, and I think in some ways, because this is kind of an evolving place, that in some ways it may be considered to be the easiest way to start the process. Another approach then would be if there was a desire to be maybe not so restrictive by limiting the number of permits, and that's where you look at the conditional use component. And because there are factors that go to the conditional use that go to parking, character of the community, and then the Planning Commission can listen to those and make a determination of whether or not that's appropriate based upon the criteria that exist. You know, one of the things you don't know here is that I'll talk probably a little bit more about this on how lawyers think in the next section when we talk about conflicts of interest and other things, but lawyers are here to advise of what potential risks are. Our goal is to try and avoid potential litigation or threats of litigation by the community because they're expensive, they're divisive, and, frankly, they're not healthy. And we don't have to look very far to know exactly how that plays out in the real world today. So balancing those competing interests can be complex when you then factor in the diversity of view on the subject matter within the community itself. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Dino, but I'll kind of stop there and see what
I have a
comment that Elizabeth
question.
generates.
So are you suggesting that you limit the number, you cap the number while it's still a permit? Like that would be the first layer?
That could be one way to approach it. I mean,
As
I really, there are, as I've looked into this, and again, the last time I did a deep dive was back in October, November last year for this presentation that we did the first week in December. I can safely say that the law appears to be evolving in a way that allows communities a great deal of latitude to exercise reasonable discretion in how, and I'll say the home rule component of what is your best for your community. What's good in Columbus or Cleveland probably isn't good for Yellow Springs, but the principles are all out there. Every community's talking about the same thing. So, one can make an argument that maybe it's best to be restrictive, but not overly restrictive. Some places have taken the attitude, we're going to be really, really restrictive and make this a barrier to entry. But what I've also heard from this community is we're trying to find that right balance because we recognize we've got an affordable housing issue here. We want to find the balance, which is by definition sometimes complicated.
So Chris, is there a problem if we would restrict it, as Mary Ann said that Brian Houch mentioned, that single-family houses stand alone with no owner living there? We could restrict saying that that could not be used as transient housing.
So if one were to say it a different way, that it had to be an owner-occupied.
Yes.
Yes.
And that would mean they could either rent a room in their house
Yes.
or their accessory dwelling unit. I have not researched this, but anytime there are differences that are made based upon types of status, we've got equal protection components that are floating out there. Before I would definitively want to say yay or nay, I would need to research that so that I could give this body an opinion that I would be comfortable with.
So then, a question, adding on to that, then where's the distinction if the person is a person that is gone for a few months out of the year? Where's, how do?
And
how
who's
do you-
going to check? Who's going to police how often they're in town?
Well,
Yeah.
but we set that up, though, I thought, so that there was still an assumption that that was an owner occupied. Somebody might be a snowbird.
Right.
If it were 8 months.
But it's
I'd
still
do it.
owner occupied.
It's still
Yeah.
owner occupied.
Yeah, because it seems as though for affordability, that is sort of a larger issue. That these smaller, single-family homes that come up for sale, of what I guess Brian was saying, that you might have them bought by somebody an investor. And they wouldn't be available as a starter home or whatever kind of home for families living here. So that, to me, makes a lot of sense to maybe restrict that.
That's what I was going to say too. We want to, if we want to keep the fiber of affordability and we lose it to an investor, that's a problem that I will have with it. That's a heartburn that I will have. It's like we're giving it away and we're always talking about affordability and we want to do all these other things, but meanwhile, we're pulling something out. We're taking something right off the table for a starter home, for someone to be affordable, to have that house and to have it as a B&B,
Well,
Airbnb.
so let me ask this question. Would there be a consensus that the more affordable homes tend to be in the residential zoning that tends to be higher density? Or that's not a, that's
They
not,
probably do, but I think that there are actually probably smaller homes all over the community.
so
You know,
our
probably
resident,
most of them are in.
my
this area.
observation is, but I'll defer to those of you who have lived here longer, is that the residential zoning map does not necessarily define, it doesn't represent what actually may be there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a couple of the people that came to the meeting before that were very vocal would be people that would not be able to do this anymore, and they are members of the community. But they don't live in these
Yeah, one
transit
of them
guest lodging
lives in the
establishments.
township, don't they?
One lives in the township and one lives in town, yeah.
And the other one lived,
In town, and then there's
the
obviously.
younger one lived in
And
Columbus.
there's,
But that's,
right, but there's
That
also,
house is gone, though.
That house-
That house is gone.
that's not an Airbnb.
That's not an Airbnb, it's no longer an
Which
Airbnb.
one?
The one
The
on,
couple from
on Lincoln.
Columbus, so they're, that's for sale.
it's
on
it's-
South High?
Lincoln and
Lincoln,
South
Oh,
High.
South
no,
High.
Lincoln, that wasn't the same couple. No.
Lincoln South High, there's a pending. there's
There is a pending, and that was a person that completely lived, and I never heard, it
In
was a
Columbus.
gentleman, yeah. No, Blacklick, Ohio,
Yep.
yeah. But that other couple lived on South High.
Well, at this point, though, if we pass something like that.
Yeah, there's two
They
of
would be
them.
grandfathered
One
in.
on North High, one on South High.
They have been. There's another trend. I noticed that one of the communities in Miami Valley recently on some sign legislation included language that said, yes, the existing signage was grandfathered in, but only for a period of 10 years. So there are some other trends that appear to be happening where maybe there's some limitations on how long something would be grandfathered in. Again, I haven't looked at the constitutionality or
Do we
the-
want to go down that road?
Well, I'm not jumping up and
Yeah.
down for that, but
Yeah.
I mean,
what
if
I-
your
what I'm
grandfather's
saying.
your grandfather.
Right, but what I'm saying is that we see these things that are happening in communities in Ohio, and frankly, throughout the nation in some ways.
Yeah.
And part of that's probably a little bit of a pushback to be the belief that the state legislature's eroding our home rule powers. But I think when it comes to the housing component, there's still a great deal of deference that's put there. And so, you know, in the context of this, this discussion on transient guest lodging, what I will say is what I always like to say to any client, but particularly public sector clients, is tell me what you would like to do, and then we can figure out a way to do it. Because some of the things that you're struggling with aren't legal issues. They are policy issues, pure and simple, which means by definition, you might get consensus from various constituencies, but not everybody.
And you might be able to help with this as well, because one of the things that comes to mind, I understand the motivation of your questions, but is there a difficulty defining owner occupied? I mean,
Well,
you know,
yeah, if you're saying you could in theory define it by days. So for example,
and then it's a matter of.
and this was in my,
verifying.
I'm probably going to botch up my memory of what the communities are, but I know that in Philadelphia and San Diego, they took the same approach but in different ways. They said that you could only lease out a unit for 180 days, and then, but in one place, you had to affirmatively show it, and the other place, it was assumed that you would do it, so it became an enforcement
Right.
issue. So again, to my knowledge, I've never seen that those have been challenged. You could arguably put in day limitations, which
That
we've
might be
discussed.
a better way to go on it.
So I think that, I would say that community responses to this issue, and every community that has a certain demographic is dealing with it. When I say demographic, why do people want to come to Yellow Springs? It's a fun place to come. That's a little different than why people might go to Columbus. They may go there for a Ohio State game, they may go there for a sporting event, whatever that might be. But the local control part, it seems to be respected, at least at this point, in this evolving landscape. So I would encourage you to be free-thinking in what you think might do it, and then we'll walk it back
see.
on a point-by-point if we think that there's a legal issue to it. So other than some restriction on absentee owners or not, and here's my concern. is that, what's the difference between saying, well, you have to live here, you don't, you get treated differently? Well, what if it's based on race? What if it's based on some other factor? It opens up a door that you may be able to defend it, but do we really want to go down that path if we don't have to?
Right.
I had written down from my notes from the last meeting, and I don't know if it rings a bell if anybody else, but sort of having discussed this a little bit at the last meeting, that we decided to go with returning it to conditional, and then perhaps developing a list
Right.
of
Case by
reasons
case,
why we can
Right.
reject.
Case
You know,
by
that
case.
could be specific, but then could also be applied to every situation.
But I remember that when it was conditional before, it was very hard coming up with anything that was objective and not subjective, but objective.
Right.
That you could, you know.
Well, but you've got the
limit it.
conditional use standards in the code, and those criteria are recognized, and they are, in a deliberative process, objective in that sense. Now, you may look at it as to say your individual judgment is subjective, but the criteria themselves are intended to be objectively
The
applied.
thing that worries me about it, though, is if you don't have really hard things to
Yes,
hit
yes.
with, then if you have neighbors that show up for one, and they're worried about Party Central,
Right.
and then you deny based on the concerns because of the welfare of the community and those other standards we have, but then on the flip side, you allow it for someone else, I don't know.
There was two things I was looking at, when I had one of my customers would come in, and we were talking just about this, exactly that. They said, he's got two young children. He says, I don't care that we have B and Bs, it's fine. He said, there's issues that come up, I have to be a little more, he goes, I have to be a little more vigilant because, the weekends it's partying, there's stuff going on, but it wasn't even so much that, it was a matter that you're rolling people all the time, and we've got our kids, and he says, I have.
Strangers coming in.
And that was his concern, obviously a legitimate concern. He goes, but he's not, so I have to be a little more vigilant. Not a problem, but those are things, if we go to conditional, and when it comes up for the public to come in, if they're showing up, I think we're gonna recognize that. Whereas if it's in another area, and people are saying, well, it's okay, if the public isn't showing up, I think that gives us a little bit of a direction to say there's not as much of a problem in this area per se, another area, which gives us going just by the criteria, and we're not being subjective in that respect.
Well, I think that there are clearly some things that you could layer in that would be specific to the transient guest lodging issue, that you still have your zoning code conditional use standards, but, for example, and I'd have to think about whether or not we actually need to put this in the code. We could do this as a statement from staff. But, okay, look at the density in a two-block area. And then you could use by way of example, if there's one or two, a third one may be okay, but you've already got 4 or 5, that would be a factor that would weigh against an additional permit. I guess my bottom line here is, we can get here. We can get to the place that the planning commission wants to be for purposes of a recommendation. I think that what I would suggest is, let's talk about high-level concepts that you're comfortable with as a body, and then, now, were you hoping that we would walk out of here today with a recommendation that would go to council? Or were you thinking that we would have this discussion, staff would be tasked
Yeah.
with coming back with something else?
Yes.
So I think that we should start with the simplest part, which is, okay, conditional use or not, do you want us to start with a conditional
Yes.
use piece of this and see how we may layer in a fabric of standards that could be readily understood and interpreted?
Yeah.
I would also like, and I didn't think that we sort of just talked a little bit about it, but not a lot. I would like to limit the total number, have a cap on for the community. Because when we heard the numbers, I think it was at the last meeting, that Yellow Springs really, even though it doesn't sound like a lot proportionately for our population, we have many more than the surrounding communities.
Well, compared to, the two,
And so I would like to see
Dayton
us
and Oxford,
put a
sure.
top
Yeah,
limit.
so it's funny you
Well,
say it
and-
too, because I'm along the same lines that I want I would like to see a limitation for two reasons, for twofold. for one, what you just said, Susan, exactly right, I want a limitation on it. Number two, supply and demand, if we don't have a limit, and you're gonna have a lot of these houses come up, then all of a sudden, the prices are gonna start coming down, and then people that are in the business are not gonna be making as much money in the business because there's so much supply.
But I also think that if we put a limit, that may actually help us with outside investors coming in, because there won't be a point, they would just have to rent the property.
AJ looks like he was going to say something.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, and that could be a part of after we have a conditional use, then the criteria follows, and then a cap could be part of the criteria. And then density is part of the criteria, and
I think another criteria that you can use, and what I've seen in some places, is certainly in the, what I'll call the preamble to the principles, is the idea of maintaining some level of affordable housing, is that can be a factor that goes to the conditional use. Does this have an impact on your ability to live in the village, and why? Instead of looking at it as a positive to get it.
Say that again,
So I have an accessory dwelling unit. I need this to be able to afford to live
Right.
in the village. It's an affirmative factor that would weigh in terms of granting the condition, and put it out there.
So, how would we want to handle coming up with that list of criteria?
well, if we're
That's what we
gonna
would
cap
do.
it, if we're gonna cap it,
Well-
I think also it should, I'm not so concerned about the non-residential areas. I mean, I think maybe residence A, B, C, but I don't think we need to limit it in the B, business one where it's allowed, or educational area where it's allowed.
As I'm thinking this through, what I would envision is that staff would prepare what I'll call a preamble, a manifesto of sort of the village principles on transient guest lodging. And from that, we would extrapolate what the pieces are for the conditions that we think are legitimate
Yep.
to consider.
And so we can start by doing the changes, the conditional changes to the code right now, and then have that conversation.
I think it happens at the same time.
Yeah, I think we should do it all at the same time, yeah.
I think one other point that I want to bring up, I think Brian talked about it at the last meeting. The revenue that came in off taxes the past year was what, over 50,000?
It was close.
It was 52?
I think the original estimate was about 32, and it exceeded
52.
that.
So, that's something that, again, in our criteria, look, the villages, we're generating revenue, we're generating tax dollars, and that's an important fact in this matter that we all need to realize. It says that we're realizing some real income here for the village, which is an important factor as we grow.
So I think, I mean, what I kept hearing the audience, people that were in the audience saying is that we are being reactionary to something that really isn't an issue yet. It hasn't been. And so I want to make sure that we balance this and then not hurt people in that process too. I mean, so.
Doesn't seem like what we're proposing is going to hurt any of the people who currently have it.
It's a
Have,
going forward basis.
transient housing. And even if we put a cap on it, there still is some room for it to grow. And I just wanted to mention the income thing, probably a lot of that is the hotel. I mean, it's the larger establishments that are probably generating more of the income.
Yeah.
Well, I think one other thing, and I noticed in the meeting minutes, the comment that Karen Wintrow made about, the economic development piece of this, which I think people are equally concerned with. And ultimately, the question is there going to be a saturation point in the village? I mean, who knows where that is or what that is? And there may be some data out there that we can look into in that.
One of the things, though, by making it conditional, that I noticed, when we lifted it as a conditional, we used to have short-term rentals, is what it was called. When we lifted that, everybody came in and filled out permits. You know, when we had a conditional, that in itself limited it, because I don't think people, one, didn't want to have all their neighbors notified, they didn't want to get into a public hearing where they had to come and defend their position, and they didn't want to pay the $100. I mean, it was just lots of different reasons.
Do you
But
think
that-
they were still operating or planning to operate, but just weren't going to ask for a conditional use permit?
Probably.
Yes.
I'm sure there were people that were doing, but there's no way for me to, unless it's on Airbnb and I catch
So
it.
somebody's gonna have to go on.
Yeah,
look.
but I do.
But
you
we,
know.
right now, we do
Yeah, but I
have
do
the
go on
list of all these
Airbnb and
folks.
look, yeah.
Yes.
But, you know, there's probably, I mean, there's people renting out places that
Yeah.
aren't on Airbnb, and I'm not gonna know that.
Right.
Airbnb is the way that I catch it.
Yeah.
So conditional use is a good thing then. I mean, it's
I
gonna,
th-
yeah,
Yeah. I think so,
it makes them work for it.
Yeah.
Which
Right.
Yeah.
we all should
Then
work for
the
it,
neighbors
right?
get notified, and
Yep.
if there's
yeah.
complaints or comments, and we hear them. Then we have a criteria to fall back on if it's gonna be denied.
I think I'm worried about what our criteria is gonna be for that, because
Sure.
I don't want to, yeah, I wanna make sure
I would
that we
say it
don't
this
get
way.
ourselves in trouble.
You have, the zoning code provides the factors that are considered. What we're talking about are, and I think criteria may be a good way to distinguish it, these are the criteria that get layered into the conversation about the conditional use factors. And that, as long as it puts people on notice what the expectations are, what you're gonna be looking at, you know, the idea here is it's gotta be a fair process. And fairness starts with the notice piece of that. And I think that we can easily accommodate that. The other thing is that it sounds to me as if it's unlikely that there's gonna be any council action that will take place before the end of the summer tourist season. Which I think that what this would be year two, essentially, we did this in 2016.
2018, well, 2018 was when it started as permitted. And
I
you,
thought it was 2018, it was 17 or 16, we started the discussion.
yeah.
Seems like it was longer ago.
The transient license tax went into effect January 1, 2018.
Okay, so I think that having another experience of a peak season and see what else is there, and if PD's tracking information on what's going on in those areas where there's transient guest lodging. And then what I'm hearing is that Planning Commission is asking staff to, let's start with a concept of conditional use, that there is a willingness to consider a cap. You would like to know if there's some basis to rationalize or justify a cap, to see what else is out there in other communities. Maybe if we can find a community that's similar in size and scope to the village to see how they've handled it, which I'm sure that
Yeah, I
there is.
have heard communities putting caps
Yeah.
on them.
Yes, they have. And that's common. I mean, that's what they do with liquor
Yeah.
licenses. I mean, that's a common acceptable practice. And so is there anything else that you
Well,
would?
what about this owner occupied thing?
Well, I would like to consider and I'm not, I guess, saying owner but I guess maybe I am, but that you can't have a standalone house. That is, and maybe it would be the way you said, like, you couldn't use it as a transient housing more than X number of days. But somehow, to make it so that it's not so attractive to an outside investor
To buy a
to
house.
purchase a small home, or whatever size home, and use it as an Airbnb.
I think we can look into that.
Okay.
I'm aware of some places that have, I don't think what they've done is they haven't identified owner occupied. It's the days of use restriction that is
Yeah.
the deterrent to the owner occipied or
Yeah.
So they can't do it on
outside
holiday.
owner. Right, well,
Well, that's,
we're not identifying somebody
No,
who's
just
an
the number
outsider
of
on it.
And that sounds like an easier thing to define.
days of use, yeah.
Verify.
It's neutral in its application.
Only weekdays.
But keep in mind, though, that if we did that, then that could have,
Yeah,
then
just
then
some
the
high-
collateral side damage that could cause is that it limits the owner-occupied component to X number of days, which then may have an impact on the
Does it, or would it
affordability.
Does it?
only, could you make it only for standalones?
Maybe. I mean, we've kind of done that already
I think that's
because,
what we're sort of wanting.
because you have to be owner occupied in order to be able to do the accessory dwelling unit, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you're still on the same, if you do an accessory dwelling unit, if you're on the same property, I consider that owner occupied.
Yes, and that's it. I would
Yeah,
also consider that.
but in the case of, we have people in town who have a house, and maybe they have an accessory dwelling unit, but then they also have a rental, and they, have an accessory, or they rent it out. I mean, they're not living on that property.
But we're not letting people who have the single house own another house that has an accessory dwelling unit, rent both of those as transient guest. They can't do that.
Yeah, they can.
They can?
As long as, if it's a single-family zone, if you have a single-family home and you want to have an accessory dwelling unit, you can do that. But,
But then a second property, right? Is
It's-
that what?
yeah,
I'll
it
I'll
already
defer
had
to
an
you. I'm
accessory-
working off a
yeah,
long
in my,
memory.
yeah. I don't think there's anything, I have to go back and look at the,
We can figure that out.
yeah, I don't think that it says anything about that the owner has to live in the principal dwelling in order to have the accessory dwelling. It just states that the, it can't be separately metered, that the meter has to tie in with the primary dwelling. And the accessory dwelling, let me see, I can look it up real quick here. Under the. A second dwelling unit subordinate to the principal dwelling that shares ownership and utility connections with the principal unit on a single-family zone lot.
Okay, but can you Airbnb both of them?
Well, it doesn't say
I
anything
didn't
about,
think you could, but we don't have,
I don't know, I mean,
And maybe that's something that we should look at. I don't know.
yeah. Because right now, there's not, I mean, it shares ownership, it just means that you have the same owner for that property.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we want to put anything on B1, any kind of conditional use, or just let it be open? Would be,
Oh, I think it
Because
should still be a
the-
conditional use hearing, but if you're gonna do any caps, I don't think you need to do a cap in
in
B1.
B1, right, okay.
I
That's
think
what I'm
more,
saying.
it'd be more, I think a cap would be more for your residential
Okay,
areas.
so B1, just let it be open. All right.
I mean,
what
I
about
would
the-
just,
what are there
Because of
units above the
tourism.
businesses in the central business district?
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, is that a concern at
Only a
all?
couple, it looks like. Maybe three.
Oh, you mean here in the map?
Yeah.
no, those are just rentals.
Yeah, I think a lot of those are just, but there are a lot of downtown rentals that are,
Well, those,
Above
these are
the
transient
shops.
guest lodging.
yeah, these are transit guest lodging locations.
Was there anything surprising about the disbursement of where the activity was occurring that was surprising at all?
Well, I thought it was surprising of how many, is that limestone?
Limestone's unbelievable, right?
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
It's a
And
lot.
there's, in fact, there's that three that are grouped all together. I was surprised.
Yeah, limestone surprised me.
I think that's kind of a lot.
Hell, right, yeah.
Not her, but somebody across the street.
Okay, so what I've summarized for what Planning Commission is asking staff to come back with is a concept of, one, conditional use seems to be a consensus that you want to explore. You would like to know how that would be evaluated in an application hearing process. The merits, pros and cons of caps, and whatever data we could find to support the number that we recommend.
Yep. The conditional use
And I'm gonna
criteria.
put this as a slash, but owner-occupied limitations or slash days of use limitations, and understand how that might impact.
Yep.
And anything else that you can think of in a broad way?
The only other thing that I was concerned about, and I understand like with organizations like Airbnb, that there are certain safety restrictions or requirements for, I was wondering if we could make sure that any of the permitted, transient guest lodges, that they have a smoke detector and a carbon monoxide detector.
One, that's a great question.
Yeah. I mean, and could we, out of the permit fee, could we provide them for them?
I would not do that out of your permit
wouldn't?
fee.
Oh, we-
You're only charging $100.
Well, our permit
Charge
is only
more.
$25.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for right now.
I
it's only $25.
I'm just trying to think of
I
a way to
recall
make
there was
sure
a-
that they were there.
I recall there was a discussion about that, and I think that there's the Airbnb operator, or actually technically the transient guest lodging operator is required to display the permit in the unit. I think that the rationale behind the display of the permit was that way a guest would know how to go about making a complaint that was not necessarily to Airbnb, but it could get to an agency to address an unsafe condition.
safety.
Now, we did not address in any outside inspections, which I think would be done by Greene County. And that gets into occupancy permits and other things, which may not be a bad idea. I mean, we don't need to go into pros and cons of that right now, but that's a whole nother animal, because then you'd add in another cost. They'd have to pay, we'd give the permit that you could operate, but then they'd have to get an occupancy permit probably from the county.
I had a question too about liability if the village is issuing a permit and then that transient guest lodging owner does not use any safety features, there's no smoke detector, there's no carbon monoxide detector, and then there's an issue. If I were the person staying at the Airbnb, I might choose to retaliate against the village because you had issued that permit. So that if one of the conditions you imposed were that to get your permit, you're required to provide all standard smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, et cetera, then if they're out of compliance with that, you've imposed the condition, the person issuing the permit assumes compliance. I don't know if you can go any further than that, but at least
In order to lose the qualified immunity that would likely flow from that, there would have to be some egregious conduct on the part of the village. But if there had been a decade worth of transient guest lodgings and there was evidence that no inspections had been done or no enforcement, yeah, that could create the possibility for some type of gross neglect that could pierce immunity.
Could we task Miami Township Fire Department to do any kind of inspections, or you think it'd be county?
I think that those are all things that we could have a discussion about. And we can look into that and see what we have and what we ought to do. But I do recall that we had discussions about that on the front end, back when we were having the discussions two years ago.
I remember it, but I guess, I don't know why we ruled out fire detectors, smoke detectors, because it just seems like a wise thing.
Well, keep in mind that many residential lenders will not allow you to engage in commercial enterprises unless you get a different type of insurance, you get different types of things. I mean, that's one of the issues here. Sometimes these operators are, it's caveat emptor for the people who stay there. I mean, if you've ever had a bad experience in one.
And when it was conditional use, I thought we said they had to show proof of insurance. Wasn't that right, Denise? No? Okay, I thought they did.
No, I was wanting more emergency contact information.
Yeah, I
That's
remember
kind of
we
what
wanted
knocked it
emergency
into a
But I thought
permitted.
we said they had to have insurance.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I just don't know how we'd regulate that as far as, we can say on the form, you know,
I mean, they're running a business. I mean, I run my business, I have got to show liability, you got to carry your waiver, you got to carry the waiver.
You
if
would
you're-
present it at the time that you
Yeah.
get your license, and then it would be subject to annual
yeah.
production. I mean, I think that's a manageable dynamic, but I think there's a series of things that have to go with that, which obviously is a public safety, health, safety, welfare concern that
I mean,
probably ought to be looked at
I don't know
now.
what Airbnb does now with everybody. I mean, is it just automatically just falls on your homeowner's insurance?
Airbnb, I think, has another layer of insurance, but the issue isn't Airbnb necessarily. The assumption that, Airbnb's taken on that generic term, it's not. I mean, you don't have to have any affiliation.
But
The RBO.
primarily, almost everybody that advertises with Airbnb, so I don't know if they have any kind of standards as far as things like smoke detectors.
I believe Airbnb does have standards, but independent of what Airbnb does, we would need to have our own based upon what we're talking about. It's a local
Okay.
control issue.
All right, okay.
So is there anything else on those points?
Yeah, I'll do some more
Just
research.
just keep plugging
Just
away,
need more
Denise. Thank
research.
you.
All right,
Okay.
okay, so I guess we could have this guy
So-
come back in then.
So we now have had our 5 public hearings, or?
No, we're not, well, I mean, we're not even gonna, are we?
Yeah,
even
we're not gonna have it.
We're not gonna talk about any of these, so, because we're gonna go back to getting more research. I mean, I put standards in that we had before, which was, maximum occupancy determined by the health department requirements. If it's located in an accessory dwelling unit, no more than 2 adults shall occupy the accessory dwelling unit. I wanted to match these up with the ADU requirements.
Well, I guess, can we pass the conditional, make it conditional use, or do we need to wait?
I really think we should do it all at the same time, because otherwise, I'm literally going to,
Yeah.
I'll be going to council meetings from now until the end of time, because there's a first reading and a second reading. I'd rather have every.
With the criteria.
With the
I'd
criteria,
like- I'd
have it
rather
all
have
laid
it all
out.
as one
Sure.
package that we're
Right.
taking at
understand.
the
One
same
shot.
time, yeah.
Okay.
So we're just gonna go ahead to the,
Move on to the next step, so we
Good.
should bring those guys back in.
clarify the quorums and the voting process.
Yeah, we should bring them back in. Just move on to the next one.
Yeah. Okay, we're moving on to, the next,
An I,
the
right?
bottom
I was
two
like, have I been
public
spelling your
hearings.
name wrong the whole time? Is it?
So, just as a
Oh.
recap,
There's one that's out of whack there. You're right.
is there one that's on? Okay, well, so there was, as we discussed at the last meeting, there had been an issue with, at the Board of Zoning Appeals with we only had 3 people in attendance and it was a 2-to-1 vote. And what constitutes a quorum, according to the charter, is different than what it said in the zoning code. So I brought that to your attention at the last meeting, and you suggested I come back with a suggested text amendment for that. As well as there were some other things that came up. So we would make a change to the BZA to put that in line with the charter. This charter is silent on the planning commission voting process, but we wanted to make the planning commission voting process the same as the BZA voting process, which is in line with the charter. And then there was another one that I wanted to talk about, and that had to do with alternates. So let me just go ahead and talk about that one, and then we can come back and do these one at a time, I guess. So at the very end, it was Chapter 1220, Planning Commission.
It's Exhibit D.
Exhibit D. If a regular member can't make it, they notify the secretary, which is, the secretary of the commission is also the council clerk, that they can't make it. So then Judy will let an alternate know that we need somebody to fill in for that person. But it gets into this thing about if council has appointed more than one alternate member, then the secretary has to alternate the alternate members, and it just, yeah, I don't even know if that's even, it seems like a lot to try to remember, especially when you have BZA, which doesn't meet that often, who was on first and who was on second when, it's like, so I was thinking maybe just striking that and just try to get somebody who's willing to come and be at the meeting. And then,
Yeah, I could, I wrote in the margin there, why we're considering striking that. Because I'm sort of assuming that the language showed up in there because that was an issue at some point with multiple alternates.
yeah, well, maybe you can address that, Judy.
'Cause
Do
we
you
have
know
had-
of the
we
multi
have-
I've never
I
been-
mean, if you want to keep it, I just thought it was kind of like one of those things that seems like, oh, you got to remember
Never been
who.
an issue.
No, Denise had asked me about it. We didn't even have alternates until fairly recently. Then we only had one alternate, and then council made the change to have a second alternate. So I don't know why this language is even here, and quite frankly, for
I thought we
BZA,
had two
I'm-
for planning, but it seemed like then one moved up on the commission because somebody left.
yeah,
We
within the
were
last,
trying for two,
4 or
and
5
then
years, but
one would-
historically, no, there's been one alternate. So it's just not, it's not an issue. And I also think it's problematic because if you're hearing something which is ongoing and that alternate has been participating, and then you swap out alternates, you've lost all continuity. So I don't think that should be, either it should be mandated at all. Because if you've got something that's ongoing, for example, this discussion regarding transient guest lodging. Let's suppose that Dina's participated, but we have a second alternate. You've talked about it for 2 meetings, you've got another meeting, you're still talking about it, and I say, well, Dina, you've been here enough, I'm bringing in another alternate. You have lost continuity. So I would just strike that. I agree with Denise. And it is not like alternates are knocking at the door saying, you didn't pick me. Would love to have that problem, but it has not yet ever occurred.
Well, and BZA is a one in and one out thing,
Right.
whereas planning commission may have ongoing conversations from meeting to meeting to meeting, so there's a
That's
little
very
bit of a
true.
difference.
That
So-
is true, although
yeah.
BZA meetings have been literally 1 to 2 per year. I mean, it is. And we've been unable to get a quorum repeatedly. We finally have upped the members enough such that we are probably
We
able
have alternates, yeah.
to get a quorum, but I don't see addressing a problem which has not ever existed in the 9 years I've been here, so.
So then, as part of that then, the old language said if no alternate member can cast a vote on a matter which they weren't at a prior meeting for, and so
You're
it was
in,
like,
section C.
yeah, so section C. So, at the suggestion of Chris, he didn't see a reason why we couldn't play with that language a little bit to say, if they're willing to say that they read the minutes, that they reviewed the videotape, that they feel that they're up to speed on what the issue is, and they could participate.
And the rationale behind that is that we actually had that come up a few years ago when the solar array was before Planning Commission, and we had an issue with, I think, actually getting a quorum there, and one of the alternates needed to step in, and so we found that process worked well. Recently, I think Lisa's done that a couple times. I think all of you have probably done it to some degree when we were doing the home England. So I think it's workable, the information's there, and I think it helps add clarity to what the expectation is for members who are serving on the body.
I have a question of using the word videotape. I'm wondering if there is a better term, because right now what
I
it is.
didn't know what else.
Video recording.
Yeah, I know.
Video recording, because right now it's you go to YouTube is where you watch it.
Did you say media?
Because I thought,
So what would be the best word for that? We'll ask our resident expert on that.
What I would say is,
This
Well,
better be
actually,
good.
Yeah,
that's
he's
where-
gonna,
yeah,
he's
but-
gonna
Yeah.
say.
Because videotape, I don't even know if you could get one, and then you're
Right.
gonna have to
Yeah.
find
I got some
somebody
in my
who still
basement.
has one.
What's the context?
Just that, if an alternate member has to come to a meeting, but they weren't at the last meeting where the discussion happened, they need to be able to review, read the minutes and review YouTube.
Recorded copy?
And that will cover DVD, YouTube, anything.
Any media
Okay.
recorded
I would
copy?
say, and the available recorded copy.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Love those big words.
Right.
Does videotape still exist?
Betamax. Laser does.
So if the alternate member cannot confirm their preparation, and so or do we assume that that we would just ask them that at the beginning of
Right,
the
they-
meeting?
yes,
confirm.
yes.
Okay,
they
so
affirm.
in any, did we, okay, upon confirmation, okay, so probably
You're
the
right.
chair would
Yeah.
get them to confirm that. Then they may not cast a vote on this matter, okay. All right, so that, I wanted to add that one in there, and so that takes us back to, we're looking at 122001, 127602, and 127801.
And I wonder, so this is supposed to put planning in line with the BZA, correct?
Which is in line with the charter.
Okay. Explain, I still don't quite understand then what it will be for planning commission.
Okay, so if there is a quorum is identified as 3 people,
Okay,
okay? But what it says in the planning commission section is that you have to have 3 concurring votes. And if you only have 3 people, then all 3 have to,
Vote.
or it fails.
yeah,
And what the charter says with the BZA and is silent on the planning commission is the quorum is 3, and it's the majority of the quorum
okay.
that decides the vote. And so we wanted to put the BZA in line with the charter. It's easier to do an amendment at this level than to do a charter amendment, which would have to be a vote of the whole community.
Yeah.
And then, because the planning commission was silent in the charter, he thought that we should, he sees that as also being the same, so we should at least clarify that in
Okay.
in this.
And in case of 4 members,
Then it'd be, if there was, it
then
was a
it's,
2 to 2,
if you have a 2 and 2, it's a split vote, and
and
you
it fails, yeah.
fails. Okay.
That's unclear to me as well.
Sorry?
I'm confused here.
What?
But when I look at section 60, oh, that's in the charter.
That's the charter,
why.
that's just
Yeah,
your
right.
review.
Yeah, that's charter.
Yeah, it's
Never
just,
mind.
yeah, it's
Okay.
just, yeah, that's just the charter.
So we need to review 1276.
So we have to have public
02.
hearings on 3 pieces.
All right. So starting with 1220.01. Okay. That's Exhibit D, right? Yeah.
D.
Any further questions from members of the Planning Commission? Okay. On Amendment 1220.01, open the public hearing. No public comments, I'll close the public hearing. And are we ready to vote on that then?
Okay, I move approval of the amendment for chapter 1220.01, the additional language for the alternate members' preparation and voting.
Second?
A second?
And that's, do we have to
Was
say,
that McQueen?
Yeah.
do we have to say anything about the language change that they just made of the, from
Changing
videotape
the videotape to,
as part of the motion
Yeah,
With,
let's do it because
as amended.
as amended? Okay.
Oh, but isn't that though, oh, yes, in that part,
Yeah,
yes,
it's here.
as amended.
As amended, okay.
call the roll on the vote for that, please.
Yeah, Stiles,
Yes.
McQueen,
Yes.
Donnell,
Yes.
Williams.
Yes.
Doden.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, we'll move on to 1276.02, which is
Exhibit B.
Exhibit E.
And in 127602, under Section E, and it says the presence of 3 members shall constitute a quorum. That's being added. The concurring vote of, and what was added, a majority of the quorum of the planning commission members shall be necessary to take any action authorized by the code. And then I put, unless otherwise specified within the code. And the reason I put that in there is because the PUD requires 3 concurring votes, and I don't know where else, there's other places in the code too that there are, like environmental commission, there's just different places, and I thought for now, let's just say, we're just concentrating on planning commission and BZA. And then again, under 127603, number 8, upon the concurring vote of a majority of village council, the village council shall decide an appeal by either. And the reason that, why did I strike that? Because I think that in other sections, the village council just always seems to have that. They don't do a majority of a quorum. It's like, it's just a concurring vote of a majority of village councils.
Is that a question or a comment?
Well, I kind of also felt like it's also an appeal. It's a little bit, I mean, what do you think? You have the village council, or you have the planning commission that makes their majority of the quorum vote.
Well, let me ask you this
Yeah.
question. Starting from the beginning.
Okay,
The charter does not address planning commission votes the way
Right.
it does the BZA.
right.
So when you look at section 66 of the charter, and where it says by a vote of majority of the quorum of the board. Now, there's 2 ways that you could look at that. A quorum is 3 of the 5, but the quorum can also be defined as who's listening. So in other words, the quorum is the minimum number. But if there's 5 people here now, 5 people here, that would constitute the quorum, because that's all of whom are voting. So we can leave of a quorum in there, we can take it out. I think that the majority of the village council is going to mean 3 of 5.
Okay.
2 of 2 is a tie. If it's 3, it's got to be 2 to 1.
Yeah, because here, under adoption of plans by the council, not all plans have to be adopted by councils, but I guess those that do, such as like PUDs and things like that, it says an affirmative vote of the majority of council members. So, okay.
We're trying to bring more clarity. We had the issue come up, I can't remember when, we had the issue come up. It was BZA, right? Yeah. And again, it's easier to do it this way rather than go back and change the charter.
So should we just take out quorum and or leave quorum? I guess I'm confused because it's majority of the, on one, when it's planning,
What I would say,
plans.
Denise, is go to what's in 65, which says by a majority of its members.
And you're just trying to get the language
But
in
Consistent.
8 to line up with
Yeah,
65.
it was just, yeah, because under zoning and building appeals, it's a majority of the quorum of the board.
Right.
And,
So you're just trying to make this language line up with this language, right?
I thought I was,
Yeah.
yeah, but, I mean,
It was a quorum in there from the beginning.
yes. Yeah, and so I was trying to make it line up with
With this here.
number 65, adoption of plans by the council, but maybe Since it has to do with appeals, maybe we should leave it alone.
Well, my suggestion would be to leave it alone because
Yeah.
it affects council vote, not planning commission vote.
Yeah.
Right, well, and actually, when you went back, you've got a majority of the quorum of the board for the BZA.
Yeah.
That's where you changed it from the 3 members.
Yeah. All right, so let's just strike that and leave it as it is.
Okay.
For number 8, we'll just leave it as, upon the concurring vote of majority of a quorum of the village council shall decide an appeal.
But that was in 1276-03 anyway, so,
12, yes, right.
okay. So any discussion from members of the planning commission on the language change in 1276.02? Okay. Open it up for public comment. Open the public hearing. Seeing none, close the public hearing. We ready for a motion to accept the changes to the language in 1276.02?
I move.
I second.
Okay, and then 1278,
Okay,
Well,
let's
we
call
oh,
it.
sorry, sorry.
Okay, would you call the roll on that, please?
Yes, Donnell,
Yes.
Doden,
Yes,
Williams,
Yes.
McQueen,
Yes.
Stiles.
Yes.
thank you. Now we'll go to, 1278, right?
Yep, 127801, under requirements for meetings, D1.
That's your exhibit C.
The appeals from decisions of the village manager and the administration of the planning and zoning codes shall be taken to the Board of Appeals, where they shall be decided by a vote of a majority of the quorum of the board. So I added that language in there.
Who is the Board of Appeals?
Who's on it?
I mean, so it does exist, there's a Board of Appeals?
Yeah, it's 5 members. Yeah.
It's elusive.
And then you had, is there an additional
There was, and
strikes
it looks
in
like
1270?
you know what, I didn't notice it, so I'm gonna have to let that go.
You didn't notice which now?
127806.
Oh, because that wasn't on the agenda.
I just, instead of amending the whole chapter, I just 127801. So why don't I just bring this back to the next, with the other thing, and we can just finish
Well, should we
the,
do the 1278-01, get that out of the way?
yeah, you can if you want, yeah, go ahead. And we'll just have to come back on 127806.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, because then we'll lay them out so that you know what you've passed.
Yeah.
And then
Right.
the ones that are still hanging in the
So any
balance. Yeah.
discussion on the changes to 1278-01 D1? Okay. Open the public hearing. Close the public hearing. I'd like to make a motion on accepting the recommended changes to the language in 1278.01.
So move?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved in second. Would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Williams,
Yes.
Donnell,
Yes.
McQueen,
Yes.
Stiles,
Yes.
Doden.
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right. Yay.
Okay, so that, I guess that concludes what we're going to be doing with the public hearings for tonight.
And I'll bring back 127806.
Okay. Don't have anything listed under old business. And so we'll move on to,
Can I say something
Sure.
now? I just wanted to let everyone know that subdivision regulations are, I'm going to be meeting with Matt Hoying. See, I was texting Johnny to find out if he's going to come tomorrow. He was scheduled to come tomorrow, but he has the subdivision regulations, and he's going to make some suggestions, so hopefully I can bring something to the next meeting.
And who is he?
He's our engineering firm that is working on the stormwater,
Great.
so,
And what's the name of that firm? Do you?
Choice One Engineering. And he said he'd be happy to look at it.
Any other old business? Right, new business, the sunshine information / refresher.
I guess this falls on me, so
Okay.
I'm going to make this as quickly as possible so that we can get out of here in a reasonable time. I think that when it comes to the issue of sunshine law, open records law, ethics matters, conflicts of interest, the thing to keep in mind is that they're not always intuitive, that sometimes people can find themselves in a situation that one wouldn't think would happen. And I'll give you an example. This happened, was reported fairly recently. A supervisor finds out somebody that he supervises is going through a divorce, needs a place to stay. This person happens to have a rental property, lets that person stay there. Seems like a generous act. Except that the Ohio Ethics Commission took the position that it wasn't, because that supervisor was also in the chain of command, did performance evaluations for that employee, recommended raises, and that the Ethics Commission concluded that there was a conflict of interest because there was a pecuniary component to the rent and the possible raises for the employment status. And so what became arguably a generous act became a problem. And so I think that's kind of an extreme example, but it's just one of those things that, again, things aren't always as they seem. And so I think that in my time with the village, I think that people have tried to be conscientious and appropriate. I just want to highlight a couple things. I've given everybody a handout from a 2017.
That was really helpful. It was a nice
I gave him the APA
Yeah, but I
standards.
gave another
Yeah.
one, a PowerPoint, yeah. So, and you can go through this on your own time, and most of you are familiar with them. I just point out that under the most extreme examples, the personal liabilities are possible. That just doesn't happen very often, and I can't imagine it would ever be an issue here in the village. But there are certain things that can happen that could expose the village to liability if Open Meetings Acts resulted in some violation. One of the things that everybody has to be concerned about, because it could have an unintended consequence, is the idea of round-robin meetings, which could be because people are talking among themselves who are on the body, but it can also happen because there may be an individual who has something before the body and starts talking to all the individuals themselves. That can be a form of a round-robin meeting as well. So people have to be mindful of that. The other thing is that people have to be mindful of how many hats they wear. So Mary Ann is the council representative in the Planning Commission. Sometimes there's conflict between those positions because you are a decider here, and less than you are as a legislator on the council side. But we have examples on occasion. The Home Inc. was one where council actually is the body that's making that decision. Ted, you've got professional conflicts every now and then, and again, I think, I want to just make it very clear, I think that in my tenure here, that these situations have been handled well, they've been handled appropriately, people have asked the right questions, so this is not being done because there's a belief that there's something going on that shouldn't. We don't need to talk about what a public record is.
Can I throw something in there
Sure.
real quick, Chris? Something that staff can help do, Jonathan Brown called me. I left a message on my phone to please contact him so that he can discuss this matter, and I didn't return the call. But I think that, Denise in particular, when something is coming before that, and Jonathan's inquisitive as he can be, but just to remind the applicants that they're not to talk or even reach out to the board would be very helpful.
That's why staff exists. Staff is the buffer, because staff, while they're certainly interested in an outcome, staff's job is to provide neutral information and then an opinion so that the body can appropriately deliberate and exercise the body's independent judgment that is reflected through the individuals who make up the body.
Another one, I guess I want to mention, Denise and I went to a training a couple months ago. And one of the things that they said that talked about that and this happens in a small community, if you're at the grocery store and if somebody comes up to you and wants to start talking about things that are going to happen at the Planning Commission, you're supposed to say something nicely about, well, under the sunshine laws, I really can't discuss that here. If you would come to the meeting and talk about it at the meeting so that the other members can hear it also. But I can see us being cornered And you might, if you didn't realize that, you might just, listen or talk to the person, and you have to not.
And that sometimes is awkward because you don't
It's
want
very
to appear to
awkward.
be rude to people when they're simply trying to share how
Yeah.
they view things. Another thing you can also tell them is that if they can't attend, they can always send an email to
Yes.
staff.
Yes,
Or
email.
communicate concerns they have that way. So we all know what ex parte communications are, which is on page 3, slide 9. And again, we can make reference to that. They do occur sometimes unintentionally, and if it rises to that level because it's substantive, then I think disclosure can remove the taint of that. I want to, on page.
Can I
okay,
ask you a
yes.
question? Because I've been hearing about the city of Dayton. And,
Hearing or reading?
and I just kind of like, I thought that was, wow. I mean, it's like, we're a small community, so,
Well, if the allegations are true, that's clear criminal, that would constitute, as described, clear criminal conduct. And, the types of situations that we tend to find ourselves in are in those areas of gray, that they're relationship-based. Frankly, what I'll call the business conflicts, those are easy. You know those immediately. Almost none of the conflicts that we've ever had to deal with are because there's a direct pecuniary interest with somebody. I mean, Ted, certainly you've had those before, particularly when Karen was on council, and those were simple. She recused herself, walked out of the room, and you did your job, and we've done that here. The shades of gray
Yeah.
are where we struggle.
Yeah.
Because you want to do your jobs diligently, you don't want to be rude to people, they have something to say, and finding the pathway to manage that is what we hope to accomplish with this discussion. The conflict of interest and where the Ethics Commission really, really focuses on things is where there is a direct pecuniary interest to you or a family member, but that can also be direct. And, Susan, we had that come up in your situation because of the affiliation with Home Inc., where the package there, the material that Judy put in the packet referenced that because you were part of a process that was advocating a position. Again, I was handled appropriately, and no reason that can't happen. Again, as a small community, these are going to happen. That's just part of life. And the smaller the community, the more likely there is to have an issue there. On slide 12, we talk about abstention versus recusal. I will tell you, functionally, there's not a huge difference there. I think abstention, what you might tend to see is somebody sitting at the dais and choosing not to vote, as opposed to recusal, which means not taking part in the process. And I think many times, if one is recusing, arguably it is better just to walk out of the room. Okay. The next series of slides really talk about the types of conflict and.
No, wait,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question about that when you recuse yourself, because you had told me with the Home Inc., now I've been off that board now for over a year.
Now you are, yes.
But you had told me that because I didn't lose my free speech rights. So you said I could actually sit in the audience.
And again, that's on a case-by-case situation. The other
No, I
piece
was
of that.
sick, or I was away, I was in Florida, so it didn't matter, but.
Right. Well, and so one of the other things that example is a good one, Susan, is that even, there's kind of a test, is it how much time has passed? But I believe because of the Home Inc. Application, those were being discussed during that period of time that you were on the board, and I don't want you to divulge what
No.
was a fiduciary or not. But in that hypothetical, if the group that you were affiliated with, you were part of those discussions that is going to come before the body, and in this case, it would be Planning Commission, they were deciding on that, then that would be appropriate for recusal, even if more than a year passed, because of that knowledge that existed. Let's see, I think that the rest of these things are things that you've heard about the duties to disclose conflicts. I think that for Planning Commission, because the applications tend to be one-to-one, By that, I mean is you have an entity, it might be more than one person, but there's a person or an entity that's coming forward with a specific request that, for property that entity owns. This body is making decisions about that property. That is an act that is not any different than if you were a judge in a criminal or civil case. And it would be absolutely inappropriate for the defendant in a criminal case, for example, to go and have private conversations with one of the judges about his or her case. That's functionally the equivalent of what you are. Now, I realize that sometimes you don't always know that somebody's going to be an applicant, okay? I think that you just have to use your best judgment on that. People need to know, but again, that's where staff is your safety valve. And if you find yourself in that situation, if you ever feel uncomfortable, sometimes your gut is the best test on how to manage these things. And certainly I would tell you, if there's ever a situation that comes up, get a hold of me. If you don't have my numbers, Judy will get them to you. If you have questions, go to Judy, and if Judy thinks you need to get to me, she will, or Denise. Again, I don't think that anybody, particularly, you're doing this for the benefit of the community. None of you should ever feel pressure or stress because of some potential conflict issue. You are here because you are committed to serving this community, and it should be a rewarding experience, not a stressful one. In an ideal world.
Well, and I would say, to add on to that, there is the other factor that's got nothing to do with money, nothing to do with pecuniary interests. It has to do with public perception. If you are not perceived of as fully fair to every applicant that comes before you, you've lost the trust of the community. The only way to always appear to be a fully fair body is to diligently recuse on any issue that you think you potentially have even the perception of an interest in. I definitely err far further on the side of recusal than does Chris, because of that public perception issue in a small community where person A may come before you on one side of an issue this month, and 3 months down the line, they're coming before you on the other side of an issue. So I come down on that a lot harder in terms of thinking about whether people should recuse or not recuse, and then essentially it's, go with your gut and weigh it between, what the solicitor says you can do and what I'm saying you might not want to do.
My mentor, John Chambers, who used to be the solicitor here before I was, would often say that you're almost always better off on erring on the side of the safe route. That may not always be the case, and again, if you're ever in doubt, let's have that conversation, because I know that you would rather take part in the process, and if you want to, and it's appropriate, then we'll find a way if we can see if we can do that.
When I was on BZA, I'm probably one of the biggest ones that has conflicts all the time, but, if I ever got a sense that I was on the wrong side perception-wise, I asked the board, while there, look, I'm putting this out there, full disclosure, this is a situation, does the board feel like I might have a conflict here? I don't think so, but I want to make it public. And they would debate about it and say yay, nay. And that worked, I think that worked really well, because, you live in a vacuum.
And there's no requirement to do it that way. Some people may not want to have that, want to go through that process. But I think that as long, again, the problem with the appearance of impropriety can lead to challenges. Sometimes those challenges could be legitimate, sometimes they may not. Knock on wood, since I can recall one time in maybe the last 15 to 20 years, has there been a litigation issue that pertained to something involving, I think, Planning Commission, and I think that was the Strewing litigation. Actually, I don't think that was. I think it was more of a council issue related to how that played out. But my point is that the BZA, the Planning Commission, and Village Council, I think, have always been very, very respectful of the property rights of the real property rights of the people who live in this community and own property. And I commend the village for that. We have avoided appeals. Frankly, we've avoided the threat of them, because I think people realize that you, the Planning Commission and the BZA and Village Council, are eminently fair. Sometimes people might argue to a fault. But I'll take that over a community that doesn't give people that opportunity. So.
Thank you very much.
That it?
Well, the agenda planning.
No, I have a question. When I was reading about the sunshine laws, it appeared to me that the Ohio State Legislature is not bound by them. Do you know if that's the case?
It's not what?
Not bound by the sunshine laws, that it makes us be bound by.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a vague recollection and from years ago that might be true. I think that there's something that they may not be bound by. But it could be the U.S. Congress. I think there's something that they're not bound by, but there's something out there, yes. Yeah, the people who make the rules don't always have to play by them.
Right,
Shocked.
okay, that's it.
Okay, the next thing was agenda planning. Marianne, you wanted to
What was it that I?
add.
Duplexes.
Add upcoming discussion about accessory dwellings with duplexes, is that right?
Was that what you said to put in?
Well, but was that in the
agenda plan?
context of transient guest lodging, or was that separate?
Separate.
Okay.
Separate.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were taking it to council.
Well, that's why I'm
Okay.
going
Okay.
now. What
Okay.
did he say? Which is the appropriate way to do it?
It's more appropriate to put it on as agenda item for public comment through Planning Commission,
Okay.
so that Planning Commission has done its deliberations to make a recommendation,
Okay.
if any, to
So,
council.
yeah, so,
So you'd like that added
Yes.
to the future?
yeah, and that's where Denise will write up
Yeah,
or
I will.
whatever, and I will submit something. And we can talk about it.
Anything else on agenda planning?
Subdivision regulations?
Yep.
Is that gonna be on?
Yeah.
Subdivision. And then you've got, are you going to be ready to
Hopefully,
bring all your
there'll be something.
public hearings back?
Yes, and then we'll be bringing back the transit guest lodging, and then that 1127806, I think it was.
Are we still trying to get a consultant to look at our, was it our subdivision? We were putting that out for review.
Comprehensive land use
Comp
plan?
Comprehensive land use plan?
Yes, no,
Yeah.
was that it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I've had, nobody has bitten on that. And I think it's probably
Really?
because what we put in is the amount of money. I had one person that emailed me and said, well, I sure would like to do that for about $70,000, but not
Really?
30. Yeah. So I don't know what's gonna happen. I sent out, I targeted letters to a lot of different companies, and I put it on the American Planning Association's, has a free advertisement site, and then we put it in the paper.
I'll say we wanted to, I mean, a major part of that was to get it so that it was on an online, user-friendly document. Not necessarily changing, I mean, there could be things changed, but, I mean, I wonder if we broke it down and advertised it.
Well, but you added that thing in there about the urban service boundary, and that requires public input, and,
Hearings and, yeah.
yeah, rather than waiting for the visioning, remember?
What do you mean, but, you mean being willing to,
Yeah. We
Go
wanted to
up.
look at that northwest side and make some decisions on that, and maybe that, I don't know. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that would take more than what I was originally hoping we would be able to do, which is more just a text update and putting it online and then going into the visioning to make that decision. I don't know. We'll revisit it. If I get nobody, the closing is Friday. So if I don't get anyone that applies, then I'll come back to you and we can look at the language again and see if we can.
okay,
Another place to look is some of the colleges, like Wright State. Because sometimes you have staff there that will do these things.
Like, I don't know.
But you said that it closes
Yeah,
on
I
Friday.
But probably not for the summer.
Didn't you speak to someone spoke to someone at a university and they said it wouldn't be a very,
That was for,
was that for a different project?
yes,
Okay.
that was for, doing a, vision for the glass farm,
Okay.
And it's getting the right department.
using a planning
Right.
department for that. Remember, Patty? I'm looking at you. Remember, the regional planning, Greene County Regional Planning suggested that maybe, the DAC at, University of Cincinnati, students could maybe do that, come up with.
Oh, when we were talking, yes, I
Yeah,
remember that.
yeah.
So, question, do you want to bring back the comprehensive land use plan as a topic to, because it's entirely likely you're going to come back with absolutely no one
That's
for your RFP, and then that needs to be revisited.
Took the
Yeah.
words right out of my mouth.
Yep.
There was also, Mary Ann brought up the inclusionary housing policy. Are you bringing that to planning commission or just
I'm-
council?
First to council.
Anything else for agenda planning? I want to talk about stormwater management.
What would we say?
Then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in
It's a
favor,
good
say
thing.
aye. All opposed?
Well, I
Aye.
want stormwater management.
I think we should get it under control now.
We're in favor
It's
of
this,
it.
it's the rainy
It's
season.
been our topic du jour.
It's just been raining.
Seconded that. Who seconded that?
Frank did.
Yes.